Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So, I wanted to start on a quick personal note that might be of interest to some of my audience. So, last week I officially announced my run for State Senate in Massachusetts to represent the 1st Essex and Middlesex District. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out my campaign website at cudney4ma.com using the number 4. With the social media launch and everything, I pushed back recording another episode for this podcast by a week, so that brings us to my motivation for the episode this week. So my partner Sarah and I observed the anniversary of September 11th on the same day we celebrated the wedding of a good friend of ours. As so many of my generation know, affording a wedding is not an easy feat in this time. My partner Sarah, as a bridesmaid, helped set up for the wedding the day before and day of, and the ceremony was beautiful. So as I was trying to write about the anniversary of the attacks on 9/11, what was probably the most formative day for my political thinking, I found my mind drifting to the economics involved with planning a wedding as a millennial. The fact that the price of having a wedding attended by all the people the bride and groom want to be there is out of reach for so many is, well, remarkably sad. It's well-worn territory at this point to discuss whether the total price tag of the war in Afghanistan, estimated at around $2 trillion, was worth it. And if you include the war in Iraq, the price shoots up quite a bit higher. The fact remains that the war in Afghanistan had its origins in a United States quest for influence, both economic and militarily strategic, and while we had a pragmatic reason for going to war in Afghanistan in 2001, there's a decent amount of evidence to suggest that it became less pragmatic and more economic over time. So, with that, I wanted to delve into the relationship between the war on Islamist terrorism on one hand and international trade on the other, with Afghanistan as kind of our case study. So, from my perspective, the best way to understand Afghanistan in its modern context, along with its neighbor Pakistan, is as part of the Mughal Empire, not to be confused with the Mongol Empire. The Mughal Empire extended from Bangladesh and most of modern day India in the east to the vast majority of Pakistan and about the southern half of Afghanistan in the west. The remainder of Afghanistan was at the time of the Mughal Empire split between the Safavid Empire, which was an Iranian empire centering around the current borders of Iran, but going a little bit further in most directions than that, and an ethnically Uzbek state called the Khanate of Bukhara. So this already tells us a lot. Afghanistan's borders ended up being synthetically created from warring groups and subsequently colonial influence. In essence, its modern borders were defined by the Russian Empire in the north and the British Raj or Crown rule in India in the south, each seeking a buffer state for their empire. Britain sought to divide Pashtun land in half, preventing the union of the historically powerful ethnic Pashtuns with their allies in Baluchistan to form the Durrani Empire, which had roughly held the territories of Afghanistan and Pakistan as one kingdom. So a state of Pashtunistan, if you will, would have been much more capable of resisting Britain and Imperial Russia. The Russian Empire, on the other hand, sought a buffer state between themselves and the Pashtuns and accomplished this by splitting ethnic Uzbeks, Turkmens, Tajiks, and so on from their kinfolk so that a mishmash remained on the Afghan side of the border. This was actually pretty explicit on the part of the Russians and British and is historically referred to as part of the quote-unquote Great Game between the two powers for control of Asia and to establish strategic positions in the event of war with the other empire. So after a good deal of civil strife, the kind of strife you'd expect from a country with manufactured borders and recurring wars with the British Empire, Afghanistan had begun to form strong relations with what had become the Soviet Union at this point, which not coincidentally had begun to survey the mineral wealth of the country. As a country with socialist aspirations, the Soviet Union seemed the ideal partner for this new era of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was beginning to undertake social reforms, including dissolving the monarchy and increasing secularization of government, but it wasn't particularly peaceful and an opposition was brewing. The United States helped stoke the opposition, consisting of Islamist mujahideen, meeting with them in secret through Pakistani intermediaries and offering aid. So when the Soviets invaded to prevent further collapse of their allies' government in 1979, it was open war, with the U.S. supporting a large number of mujahideen, although there were other groups that were funded by outside forces. This, as we know, sowed the seeds for the Taliban and their alliance with Al Qaeda, which orchestrated the attack that fateful day in September 20 years ago. Again, on sort of a personal note, September 11th was front of mind when I announced my candidacy for Massachusetts State Senate last Tuesday. And I'm, of course, speaking of Tuesday in the context of when I'm recording the podcast today, which is Monday, September 13th. In fact, talking about September 11th was originally part of my announcement video. This is because 20 years ago, yesterday was the day I became politically activated as I watched the second tower fall from my 8th grade world history classroom. And that day I realized two things at the same time. First, like so many, I was made aware in that series of attacks that we were indeed vulnerable to outside forces despite the overwhelming strength of our military. And second, I discovered my patriotism in response to this attack on our country, despite having never thought that much about politics before. I also distinctly remember the seething anger that replaced the dread and sadness, and how it allowed me to ignore for a time some nagging questions in my head, such as why was our president announcing a quote-unquote war on terrorism an idea instead of simply against the architects of September 11th? Our intelligence community was quick to attribute the attacks, although it would take 3 years for full confirmation, to Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, both based in Afghanistan. And so my second question was, why didn't we seem to care that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, a country we continued to staunchly defend as an ally for reasons that were unclear to me at the time? These questions festered in my mind as we persisted our war on terrorism, invading Iraq in 2003, starting airstrikes in Somalia in 2007, and arming rebels in Syria in 2012, among many other operations in North Africa and the greater Middle East. During this time, the U.S. also maintained and grew its historical military alliances with Israel and Saudi Arabia, despite their humanitarian crisis-inducing involvements in Palestine and Yemen, respectively. So, this was the time in my life that I started looking to the history of these conflicts, and how, as just one example, we armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to combat a perceived expansion of Soviet influence in the region, and all that stuff that I already kind of got into in talking about sort of the history of Afghanistan already with you. This was also the time in my life that I started to, notice how pervasive and callous our interventions militarily elsewhere were, often supporting authoritarians over democratic governments, and eventually, probably too slowly, I would hazard to say, the reasoning became clear to me. It was trade. We needed these alliances, and we intervened in these countries to preserve high traffic shipping routes and more unfettered access to petroleum and natural gas markets. And perhaps most astonishingly, the less democratic the government we encountered, the more likely we would be to develop trading relationships that were favorable to the U.S. economy, no matter how directly it hurt the people those governments were supposed to support. So I should state for the record that I believe the Biden administration made the right call in withdrawing from Afghanistan. I think I've stated that a couple of times over the course of this show I've been building with you. And the fact is, it was going to be messy no matter how we got out. And however much I would have liked to see bin Laden face trial, that was clearly not the way he wanted to go out. And our executive branch appears to be attempting to unwind, however unevenly, our military involvements that cost American lives without much material gains aside from ostensibly the trade relationships I've attempted to show how much we clearly value. But the cost of just that one war is staggering, around $2 trillion depending on your measurement. And the Biden administration released their intended defense budget for next year, which is roughly $753 billion, which is about $10 billion up from last year. It's overwrought territory to describe how large a percentage of our budget this is, how monumental our defense spending is as compared to other countries, but there it is in black and white for you, the numbers. And so that brings us, to kind of elaborate, that brings us to the current state of U.S. trade with Afghanistan. Currently, Afghanistan's biggest export as a percentage of their economy is gold, and the U.S.'s largest import from Afghanistan is, as you guessed it, gold. In addition, a geological survey performed in conjunction with the Pentagon in 2010 revealed an estimated $1 trillion in untapped mineral deposits in Afghanistan, primarily lithium, cobalt, and carbonatites, I believe is the word for it, which contain large concentrations of rare earth minerals. So this geological survey happened in 2010, and we killed bin Laden a year later, but remained militarily engaged in the country for literally another decade. These mineral resources are untapped almost entirely due to lack of necessary infrastructure for their extraction and processing. So, as we honor the dead 20 years on from 9/11, we should consider the impact of that war on Afghanistan itself. This, of course, includes roughly 46,000 Afghan civilians and over 2,000 American servicemen and women. But we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge how the borders created by our historical allies, the proxy wars we imposed upon their territory against our strategic enemies, and the persistent specter of a country we hope to exploit economically, how that all factors in. Clearly, we were patently unsuccessful in establishing a government stable and pliant enough to extract resources from. And I say that glibly, but it's just the truth of the matter. This is the way we conduct business in the so-called developing world. So when it comes to, strategic and trade implications of this military interventionism that the U.S. engages in, there's something to be said for a deterrent of a sort, right? The size of their military is meant to frighten people away from making adversarial moves against our allies, and that can't be discounted. But in addition to our impact on these countries, as I've described so far, we should think about war's impact on us. We know, like I said, our military spending dwarfs everyone else in the world, but especially when asymmetric wars are challenging our strength as a military power, isn't it time to say that perhaps we're becoming a more multilateral world where influence it should be more shared? And are we willing to at least consider supporting democracies even if it risks a less favorable trading relationship? And are we willing to engage with alliances that might disagree with us, even veto us on when to intervene militarily, on the hope that they'll agree on the right times to actually go in? We've created, as it is, a lot of enemies in an attempt to extract something from folks who were then allies. Afghanistan is a marked example of that. But, when I find myself sitting, trying to write about this kind of thing as I, prepare for my friend's wedding, it occurs to me that we can do better by the world by becoming better ourselves, by investing more at home. It's obviously not a new idea, but I hope the context I've provided brings some new light to this notion. So I wanted to take yet another episode. I spent a couple more than I intended on Afghanistan and on military interventionism, and not just military interventionism, but choices to intervene militarily. And I thought that was important to do as we see a bit of a backlash to Biden's choice to withdraw. But we're at a crossroads. As I said, we're trying to extract ourselves from these other military involvements around the world. We're expected to be out of Iraq at the end of the year. There's no telling whether that will hold. We're starting to release documents that might suggest that Saudi Arabia was more involved in the orchestration of 9/11 than we thought, or at least figures in that country were contributing forces to that atrocious set of attacks. And so whatever you have to say about Joe Biden, I mean, at least you can say that he's trying to reset our military relationship. But that's not enough when we're, continuing to require astronomical amounts of money for our military without a real public accounting of what that's going towards. If it's just about, continuing to modernize our weapons, I feel like that answer is becoming less and less savory to the American public. But I guess, what I'm trying to get at with this, with what I've been saying, is that we need to recognize this relationship between involvement in the Middle East, as we call it, the war on terrorism, and trade. We need to start acknowledging the choices that we've made and why we've made them. And hopefully the idea is that we can use that to inform how we pursue things going forward. I talked about, different borders for countries, the idea that, Britain and Russia intentionally created borders that would keep Afghanistan, if not in flux, at least less powerful, by not creating room for Pashtunistan, for example. And we have to acknowledge that that was a choice, right? That was an intentional choice. That's something I feel like I haven't really heard much from the media about. And I talk, from time to time on the podcast about democratizing borders of states, and I usually talk about that in the context of U.S. states within the context of our federal system of governance. But you can think of that in the context of places in the greater Middle East that might be seeking or might be better off with a certain kind of self-determination that leads to a more stable country, and not more stable in the way that unfortunately we like to think of it as a U.S. trading partner, as I've tried to talk about, but stable in the sense of able to build a player on the global stage that is seeking democracy, that is in reasonable control of their resources, but willing to engage in smart economic partnerships and all that. This is important stuff for us to look at going forward. And at this point, I've said it a bunch of times that I'm not strictly a non-interventionist, if you will. That I do believe that there are reasons to act in support of our allies or in support of marginalized communities around the world. But I do, and I continue to be reinforced in my belief that that should be done in partnership with other democracies, other real democracies. And again, I think I've said it before, we should continue aspiring to be a better democracy, and be open to and humble enough to accept criticism when we're falling short of our democratic principles. But yeah, it feels like we're at an inflection point, and so I wanted to take some time to get into that and hopefully offer perhaps a slightly different, at least, fact pattern, if you will, on this subject. So I think I'll leave it there for today. As I like to say, I'm available to chat on Twitter at DecentFedPROJ, or via my brand new State Senate campaign account at Cudney, the number 4MA, Cudney 4MA. Alternatively, we'd love it if you hit the like button and engage in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. For those who don't know, depending on how you're taking this in, you can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. We'd also be deeply honored if you shared this podcast with a friend on social media. And next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. We'll keep you guessing, as always, on what's coming next. Until then, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thanks so much for listening.